Cadia did not fall in a day. It was murdered in slow motion, bled dry until the earth itself cracked. The Emperor protects, but never enough. Beneath a sky torn open by the eye of terror, every breath was defiance, and every heartbeat was borrowed time. This is the death of a fortress world, and the proof that in the Imperium, even the strongest walls only delay the inevitable. The universe remembers worlds not for their beauty, nor for the lives that blossomed upon their soil, but for the blood spilled to keep them from oblivion. Cadia was not a paradise. It was never meant to be. It was a fortress carved from iron discipline, a bulwark against the eye of terror, and a crucible in which generations of men, women, and children were broken, reforged, and sacrificed to the Imperium's unending war. Its fall was not simply the death of a world, it was the unmaking of a promise that the Imperium could hold back the darkness forever. Cadia was born to die. Its soil was sown with that fate from the first moment its people were armed and drilled to watch the cursed light of the warp storm burning at their horizon. The eye of terror was their sky. It bled into their nights, stained their days, and raised them to maturity, not with lullabies, but with the thunder of artillery drills. Children learned to march before they learned to pray. By adolescence, they could strip a laser gun blindfolded, assemble it in the dark, and fire into ranks of their own brothers, simulating the chaos hordes they were destined to face. For Cadia, there was no choice. The warp storm never slept, and so neither did they. The world was not defended by walls of stone alone, but by flesh sharpened into weapons. The famed Cadian shock troops were not an army raised in times of war. They were the population itself, their entire existence pressed into the endless machine of the Guard. Every street was a drill yard, every home a barracks, every family a regiment. A man was not remembered for what he earned, but for how many of his children stood in the Emperor's service when the summoning horn called. Mothers sent sons to die with pride, and fathers buried daughters in uniforms they had once worn themselves. This was Cadia, a world where grief was as common as air, but weakness was forbidden. There was no softness permitted in the shadow of the eye, yet even iron shatters when struck long enough. The forces of chaos had tested Cadia for 10,000 years. Each incursion was beaten back, but each left scars. Cities rebuilt from rubble, regiments reduced to ash, names carved into memorial walls so vast that new stone quarries had to be opened just to hold the endless roll of the dead. And still, the planet endured, because endurance was all Cadia knew. But endurance is not the same as eternity. The doom of the fortress world came not with a whisper, but with a roar. The 13th Black Crusade. Abaddon the Despoiler, War Master of Chaos, had hurled 13 invasions against the Imperium since the heresy. 11 had failed outright. The 12th had been inconclusive, but the 13th was different. He did not strike Cadia with simple rage, nor with blind attrition. He came with a plan, a blade sharpened for 10 millennia. He came with the Blackstone fortresses, colossal weapons of unimaginable power, stolen from the Imperium and turned to treachery. And he came with the will to annihilate, not merely to wound. When the Black Fleet fell upon the Cadian Gate, the void itself seemed to scream. Orbital defenses were torn apart like parchment before a storm. Fleets of the Imperial Navy fought with desperation, but the weapons of the fortresses were beyond mortal reckoning. Entire battle groups were annihilated in seconds. Where once the skies above Cadia had been a shield, they now became a graveyard of burning hulks, their wreckage raining fire upon the surface below. The ground war was worse. Chaos did not send armies to conquer Cadia. It sent tides. Demons spilled from warp rifts that tore open in the very air above the fortress cities. Cultists screamed praises to their dark gods, throwing themselves upon imperial trenches in numbers too vast to count. Traitor Astartes, once heroes of the Imperium, now led spearheads of slaughter through bastions that had stood unbroken for centuries. The Cadians fought with the fury of a doomed people. They knew no retreat. They could not. For where could Cadia retreat? Behind them lay the Imperium. Before them, the Eye of Terror. They stood because there was nowhere else to go. Even as the planet burned, the Cadians did not falter. General Ursarkar Creed, the living embodiment of Cadian defiance, commanded the defense with a clarity born of desperation. His strategies turned battles into stalemates, stalemates into victories, and victories into the illusion that Cadia might yet survive. For a time, it seemed possible. For a time, the fortress world stood unbroken, its regiments holding back the apocalypse itself. But Abaddon had not come merely to test their courage. He had come to end them. The Blackstone fortresses unleashed their power upon Cadia's very crust. Mountains shuddered, oceans boiled, entire cities sank into chasms torn open by weapons designed to unmake planets. The pylons, ancient, alien structures buried across Cadia that had once held the Eye of Terror in check, became the true target. Abaddon knew what few in the Imperium suspected. These pylons were the locks that chained the warp, and if they fell, not only Cadia, but the galaxy itself would bleed. When the last great fortress city of Kasser Krof was obliterated, hope died. Cadia could not withstand what was coming. Even then, the defenders fought on. They fought not for victory, but for defiance, to carve their resistance into eternity. But the end was inevitable. A Blackstone fortress, guided by Abaddon's will, was hurled from orbit like a spear. It struck Cadia's surface with force enough to shatter continents. The crust buckled, the pylons collapsed, the planet broke. Cadia did not fall in silence. It fell in screams, in fire, in the collapse of everything its people had ever bled to protect. The survivors were few, scattered among the stars, carrying with them the memory of their lost world. For Cadia itself was gone, consumed by the Eye of Terror, its shattered remains dragged into the warp like carrion. Yet even in death, Cadia became legend. Its sacrifice bought time. Time for the Imperium to endure a little longer. Time for the galaxy to suffer yet more wars, more horrors, more futile endurance. Cadia was not remembered as a paradise lost, nor as a failure. It was remembered as a grave marker for humanity's illusion of safety. Its death was not the death of one world, but the reminder that no world is safe, not even the strongest. Cadia stands no more, but the words of its soldiers remain carved into the Imperium's soul. Cadia stands. A phrase whispered not in triumph, but in defiance. The last defiance of a world that died on its feet, staring into the abyss, unblinking, unbroken, even as it was consumed. For in the 41st millennium, there is no peace, no respite, no hope. There is only war, and the death of Cadia is the proof that even the greatest fortress is nothing before the hunger of the abyss. The galaxy remembers, the darkness remembers, and the Imperium, forever bleeding, forever burning, marches onward, knowing that every world is Cadia, and every world is doomed. The war for Cadia was not a single battle, but an unending tide of annihilation. Orbit became a slaughterhouse before the first shot was fired on the surface. The Black Fleet carved through the void like executioners, their blackstone fortresses bleeding beams of impossible energy that unraveled the fabric of matter itself. Ships of the Imperial Navy, each one a world's worth of industry forged into a single vessel, were torn apart in moments, their crews consumed in fire before they could even pray. Cadia's orbital bastions, mighty constructs that had stood defiant for centuries, became broken shells, scattering their debris across the sky in fiery arcs that lit the heavens like a second dawn. To the defenders below, that dawn was not salvation, but a funeral pyre. They watched their skies rain metal, each streak of light marking tens of thousands of Imperial souls lost to the void. And yet, in the midst of devastation, the Imperium bled the enemy in turn. Cadian gunnery crews, drilled to perfection since childhood, fired their macro cannons until their barrels glowed. Escorts threw themselves into suicidal charges against Chaos cruisers, detonating warp-tormented hulls in mutual destruction. There was no thought of survival. Each ship fought until nothing remained but wreckage and silence. The void above Cadia became a graveyard where faith, steel, and heresy intermingled in a storm of corpses and ruin. And still, the Black Fleet pressed on. When the traitors broke through, the surface of Cadia became the next altar of slaughter. The first landings were not orderly invasions, but bombardments that cracked the earth itself. Firestorms swept across the plains, glassing soil and melting stone. The air became poison, filled with ash and the chemical stink of promethium and nerve gas. Demons poured from tears in reality, birthed not by strategy but by hatred, their forms writhing in shapes not meant for mortal eyes. To look upon them was to invite madness. To hear their voices was to feel faith itself rot within. And behind them marched traitor legions, the corrupted sons of the Emperor, clad in armor that still bore the scars of the Horus heresy, their bolters spitting death into the faces of those who had once called them brothers. Cadia did not break. It could not. Regiments formed ranks amidst the inferno, their laser guns crackling in ceaseless volleys. Caster walls became lines of defiance, bastions where men and women dug in with bayonets and grit. Creed's voice thundered across Vox networks, issuing orders with a cold precision that masked the doom pressing at the horizon. He did not waste words with promises of salvation. He told his soldiers only to fight, to hold, to bleed the enemy until nothing was left to bleed. And they obeyed. For on Cadia, obedience was not faith. It was nature. Civilians, too, became combatants. There was no difference between soldier and citizen. Every man, woman, and child who could carry a weapon stood upon the walls. Children, who had once drilled with wooden rifles, now hefted las carbines longer than their arms. Old men who could scarcely walk knelt behind sandbags, reloading for the young. Women turned factories into arsenals, forging ammunition by the ton, even as shells fell around them. There was no escape, no rear line, no sanctuary. Cadia itself was the battlefield, and its people its ammunition. But Abaddon's assault was not brute force alone. His true objective lay hidden in plain sight: the Cadian pylons. Towering monoliths of Xeno's design, planted across the planet in patterns older than recorded history, they had stood in silence for millennia. Few in the Imperium understood their nature. Fewer still guessed their purpose. But the despoiler knew. He knew that these pylons, these mute sentinels of black stone, were the locks upon the eye of terror. They held the warp at bay, restrained the storm's fury, and gave the galaxy a fragile boundary between existence and annihilation. If Cadia's pylons fell, reality itself would bleed. And so, the war became more than the defense of a world. It became the defense of reality. Chaos forces hurled themselves at the pylons in endless waves, their demonic hordes shrieking with unholy hunger as they clawed toward the structures. The Cadians fought with madness in their eyes, understanding at last why their world had been chosen, why they had been condemned to centuries of ceaseless war. They were not merely guarding the Imperium. They were guarding the galaxy from becoming a new eye of terror. Every drop of blood they spilled bought another hour of sanity for the stars beyond. The cost was immeasurable. Kasr Vortan burned for 17 days, its defenders reduced to ash, but refusing to surrender the pylon within. Kasr Holn's bastion collapsed into rubble, its command staff crushed beneath falling stone, yet the surviving guardsmen continued to fire from the ruins until traitor bolters silenced them one by one. Every pylon became a fortress, every fortress became a tomb, and every tomb was filled with martyrs who asked for nothing but more ammunition as their final prayer. The air itself seemed to choke with despair, but still the chant rose. Cadia stands. It was not hope. It was denial. It was defiance hurled into the abyss. The enemy's cruelty was not only physical, but psychological. Chaos sorcerers unbound their arts upon the defenders, twisting their minds, filling their dreams with visions of despair, drowning them in hallucinations of betrayal and futility. Some soldiers awoke screaming in the trenches, convinced they had already lost. Others tore at their comrades, seeing only traitors where brothers once stood. But for every guardsman broken, 10 more steeled themselves, their hatred of the enemy hardening into something purer than faith. Sheer, relentless spite. Cadia would not give the despoiler the satisfaction of easy victory. And yet, as days became weeks, the futility of resistance grew undeniable. The enemy's numbers were infinite. Every demon slain bled back into the warp, only to claw its way into the material world once more. Every fortress rebuilt was torn down again. The Black Fleet rained destruction without pause, stripping away defenses layer by layer. For every regiment deployed, 3 were lost. For every wall defended, 2 more collapsed. The defenders fought not for victory, but for the illusion that victory was possible. It is said that in those last weeks, the very soil of Cadia drank so much blood that it turned black, its rivers choked with corpses, its plains filled with the wreckage of tanks and the shattered remains of titans. To breathe was to inhale the dust of cremated comrades. To drink was to taste rust, oil, and ash. No dawn brought relief, only the promise of more slaughter. Yet still, the Cadians stood. They did not know how to yield. They had never been taught the word. And so the fortress world bled, and the pylons held, for a time. But every soldier knew, deep within the marrow of their bones, that they were buying hours against eternity. The eye of terror loomed above them, vast and patient, its storms pulsing with a hunger that had waited for 10,000 years. Abaddon had only to keep striking, and eventually, even Cadia would fall. In those days, despair was no longer whispered. It was a constant companion, as common as the rattle of lass fire. Yet in the heart of despair, there was a terrible beauty, the beauty of resistance without hope, of sacrifice without promise, of a world that fought because fighting was all it had ever known. Cadia stands. The words no longer meant salvation. They meant damnation. And still, they were spoken. The fall of a fortress is not sudden. It comes like erosion, the slow grinding away of everything solid until only dust remains. By the time the 3rd month of the 13th Black Crusade bled into the 4th, Cadia itself seemed to stagger beneath the endless assault. Khazars that had stood for centuries were nothing more than hollow shells. Whole regiments had ceased to exist, their names recorded in the Administratum's ledgers, even as their bodies were swallowed by the churned earth. The sky was no longer a sky, but a canopy of fire and ash, lit by the constant rain of debris from shattered voidcraft. For the defenders, day and night had lost all meaning. There was only battle, only exhaustion, only the struggle to keep the next line from breaking. The titans of the Collegia Titanica strode across this burning wasteland, walking gods of iron and plasma. Warlords and reavers alike bellowed their fury, their weapons burning craters into the advancing heretic hosts. Against them came the twisted god engines of the Dark Mechanicum, profane mockeries of the machine god's gifts, their forms warped with demonic flesh and rusting steel. Each clash between titans shook the very continent, mountains crumbling from the tremors, cities reduced to rubble beneath the shockwaves. It was not war. It was apocalypse made manifest. From the bastions, guardsmen watched the duels with hollow eyes, knowing that even if their god machines triumphed, the tide of chaos would not end. For every heretic titan destroyed, another seemed to rise from the smoke. The pylons became the true battlefront. Once passive monoliths, their alien surfaces cold and silent, they now thrummed with energy as the warp storm above seethed and pressed against them. Lightning of unnatural hues lashed down, reality buckling in ripples around their bases. Sorcerers of the Thousand Suns hurled their might at the stones, their incantations twisting the air, while demons clawed at their surfaces with shrieks of hatred. The Cadians held them in fanatical defense, choking the approaches with their dead. For every guardsman slain at the foot of a pylon, another stepped forward, lasegun in hand, to take their place. The monoliths did not break easily, but each impact, each strike, each sacrifice brought them closer to collapse. On the front lines, despair began to take form. Soldiers who had once laughed in the face of death now fought in silence, their eyes sunken hollows, their uniforms stiff with blood. They ate from the corpses of their own rations, their food long since turned to ash, their water fouled with chemicals from the bombardments. Psychers, pressed into service as conduits of battle, screamed themselves hoarse as the warp itself gnawed at their sanity. Some burst apart in psychic detonations, their skulls aflame, their souls dragged shrieking into the Imperium. Others became conduits for demons, their bodies mutating mid-prayer into horrors that had to be executed by their own comrades. Faith remained, but faith was no longer a comfort. It was only another weapon, wielded against the endless dark, a brittle candle in a hurricane of madness. And still, Creed commanded. His orders were crisp, decisive, cold as the grave. He ordered counterattacks into the jaws of chaos, not because they could be won, but because they would buy another hour, another breath, another moment for the pylons to stand. He directed his regiments with the precision of a surgeon cutting into diseased flesh, bleeding his own world for every wound inflicted upon the despoiler's horde. But even Creed's genius could not deny what every soldier already knew. Cadia was dying. Abaddon himself descended to the surface, the War Master clad in Terminator plate blacker than the void, his demon sword, Drachnian, screaming with the hunger of 1,000 trapped souls. Where he walked, hope withered. His presence was a wound in reality, a living curse upon the battlefield. He did not come to lead. He came to end. His warriors, the Black Legion, carved corridors of slaughter through Kasser walls, advancing behind their master like a tide of shadows. Against them, even the finest of the Cadian shock troops faltered, their laser guns little more than sparks against the storm. The War Master's target was clear, the greatest concentration of pylons, those whose collapse would doom not only Cadia, but the fragile balance of the galaxy. It was in this crucible that the last mask of inevitability fell away. The pylons began to fail. One by one, they shattered beneath the Black Legion's assault. Some exploded in thunderous shockwaves, leveling everything around them. Others crumbled silently, their alien structures dissolving into dust. And with each pylon that fell, the Eye of Terror surged closer, its warp storms pressing inward, reality fraying at the edges. The sky became a wound. The stars themselves seemed to bleed. The air tasted of iron and madness. Guardsmen wept without knowing why, their minds buckling beneath the weight of eternity pressing down upon them. Kasser Partox, once a bastion of defiance, became the stage for the last stand of countless regiments. Surrounded on all sides, they fought in the ruins until there was nothing left but corpses piled higher than the rubble. Survivors spoke of the ground itself opening beneath them, demonic claws dragging men screaming into the abyss. And yet, through it all, the Vox still carried the same two words, broadcast from trench to trench, bunker to bunker. Cadia stands. The phrase was no longer a promise. It was a curse. By the 7th month of the war, the planet itself trembled. The crust groaned beneath the weight of destruction. Oceans boiled away into vapor. Entire continents had become wastelands of black glass. And still the pylons fell, one after another, until the Eye of Terror roared unchained above the dying world. Abaddon had achieved what no warlord of chaos had in 10 millennia. He had broken Cadia's spine. The defenders knew it. The Imperium knew it. The galaxy itself seemed to know it. And yet, they fought on, for to be Cadian was to fight until nothing remained. No hope, no land, no life. To be Cadian was to hold the line, even when the line no longer existed. The pylons were breaking, reality was breaking, and beneath a sky torn open by the abyss, Cadia itself began to crack. The end did not arrive as a banner of triumph. It came as a calculation, precise and unmerciful. Above the burning world, the Black Fleet slowed its fury just enough to give shape to what followed. The wreck of a Blackstone fortress, half mad with warp energies, was dragged from the void like a chained god, its cyclopean mass guided by iron will and damnation. Engines screamed, reality bent. Beneath, Cadia buckled as though the planet had learned the meaning of fear. Vox nets howled with overlapping prayers, orders, and static, so dense that no single voice could command the ocean of panic below. There was no time anymore, only impact. The sky turned to a single, devouring light. The fallen fortress became a spear hurled by hatred, punching through cloud, ash, and storm with the weight of many continents. When it struck, mountains folded like parchment. Oceans turned to steam in an instant, the vapor blasting across continents as killing winds. Pylons near the site sheared into glittering fragments that fell like black rain, each shard a tombstone for sanity. Shockwaves raced around the circumference of the world, overtaking themselves, hammering the crust until it cried out with a voice of stone. The ground rose and fell as if something beneath had begun to breathe. In the chasers, defenders did not hear the end. They felt it. The earth swelled beneath trenches, sandbags leaped from the ground, and the very air detonated in a pressure that hammered lungs flat and burst eardrums. A basilisk battery, mid-salvo, flipped backward like toys, their crews hurled into the sky in ragdoll arcs. A Reaver Titan stepped once, then sank as the ground liquefied, its reactor shrieking into overheat as it toppled in a ruin of screaming metal. The commander of the God Engine recited the litany of final function through a mouthful of blood and oil until the sound cut out. There was no last stand left to make. there was only the mathematics of annihilation. Beneath the crust, fractures propagated like lightning-given stone. Entire plates ground past one another. Cities, once fortified to endure any siege, slid by degrees into their own alleys, avenues twisting into canyons. In one bastion, a medic hauled a child toward a hab-block doorway that had become a cliff, only to watch it shear off and tumble into an abyss filled with fire. He did not scream. His throat had no air to spare. Instead, he clenched his jaw until teeth cracked, planted the child behind a half-collapsed bulkhead, and tied the boy's hand to a rung with a strip of his own flayed sleeve. He pressed a data slate into small fingers that would never read again, orders to fall back to a line that no longer existed, and went to die where his regiment stood. Above, the wound of the eye widened, a crimson grin across heaven, bleeding storms down into the world like an autopsy without end. Where the pylons had once braced reality, there was only pressure, raw and implacable. Demons multiplied in the pressure fronts like rot in heat, capering over chasms and leaping into the mouths of the dying. Sorcerers, drunk on the ruin they had helped birth, were crushed flat by strata that shifted a kilometer in the space of a breath. Even victory devoured its servants. The gods had no need of gratitude. The Vox carried the sound of a fortress captain counting off his last shells, each number a sentence, each shell a meaningless period. 4. The casemate cracked and split. 3. The loader's hands remained at the mechanism, but the loader was gone, ripped in half. 2. The muzzle dropped below the horizon as the gun slid, its tracks chewed by shifting stone. 1. He fired into the ground out of habit. Then he recited Cadia stands in a whisper and set his last pistol against the breech to heat and fail. When the collapse took him, he remained upright a second longer, a figure without a world. Fragments of the Blackstone fortress continued downward, each impact a second death. The crust gave way in a fractal of fissures, trenches opening to swallow highways, bastions, and whole armored divisions that had no time to reverse or even curse. Columns of heretic armor, rushing forward to savor conquest, were folded into those same crevasses and ground into paste with everything else. Triumph dissolved without distinction. The planet had ceased to care what banner a corpse had carried. In a command dugout scratched into the underspine of a casser's last wall, a colonel received the order to disengage that no longer had coordinates attached. He repeated the doctrine anyway, naming firing lines that now floated like islands of rubble on seas of steam. Fall back to the tertiary. He said it twice, then once more to an empty line. An aide pressed a cribbed map against the colonel's chest with hands that would not stop shaking. The colonel nodded to a world that had already left, handed the aide a data wafer of casualty rosters, and stepped out into a sky that seemed to lean closer, curious to see the shape of a man standing alone. Across the chaos, ships too crippled to flee tried to lift with evacuees crammed in their bellies. Some made it 1 kilometer, some 2. The air itself tore as void shields sparked and failed, and the vessels toppled back, carving trenches of wreckage through neighborhoods that had already died 3 times over. A barge filled with medici and orphans pivoted in the updraft, turned sideways by a wind made of gravity, and settled onto a manufactorum roof with the tenderness of a hammer blow. The children did not cry. They watched their reflections warp in the heat haze and folded their hands as they had been taught. Faith was not a path out. It was a way to stand still while the floor moved. Not even the War Master could command a world in fracture. Abaddon watched from his vantage of ruin as the planet answered his ambition with exactly what he desired: collapse. His vizier engines recorded the lines of cracking stone as a scribe might record a litany. The demon blade seethed in his hand, a choir of swallowed souls keening for more. He granted them silence with a thought. The work was done. The fortress was a ruin. The gate would open wider. The age would blacken. He turned away because the rest was merely aftermath. There were survivors, because there are always survivors. A shuttle slammed sideways through a maelstrom of glass and bone, skittered along the flank of a dying Hab spire, and came to rest with its nose buried in a mound of broken shrine statuary. Inside, a platoon lay stacked in heaps of armor and limbs, every eye filmed with ash. One soldier woke to the taste of copper and the stink of melted plasteel. He crawled over his commander's body, found the Vox bead still live, and whispered his location into a spectrum that nobody controlled. Somewhere, days or minutes away, time had no edges, another bead crackled in answer. A convoy, a saint, a machine priest, a Xenos thief, a ghost. What answered does not matter. What mattered is that the soldier stood, slinging a weapon that had no charge, and began to walk across a map that no longer corresponded to any terrain. Remember this: when a world dies, it does not vanish. It lingers in the lungs of those who breathed its dust and in the weight borne by those who escaped its gravity. It haunts the language of orders on worlds that still pretend to be safe. It stains metals, not with glory, but with the knowledge that the metal was minted from scrap hauled off a grave. The last pylon fell with a sound like a bell hit underwater. The eye sagged downward, not a storm now, but a horizon. Veil lines of reality that had held for 10 millennia unspooled in a moment, and the wound across the galaxy widened. In the distant dark, navigators felt their sanities buckle as the star lanes kinked and tore, a new age of night flowering out from the corpse of a fortress world. On Cadia, fissures met and married, and the planet's silhouette became a necklace of separate stones, each burning, each falling inward, each dragging at the others with tides of molten core. There were orders to evacuate. There were orders to hold. There were orders to die well. None mattered. The only truth remaining was gravity, and gravity had chosen the abyss. Voxcasters sputtered out on a last frequency, repeating a phrase that was now a memorial more than a rally. Cadia stands. The words reached ships already fleeing, men already dead, gods already feasting. They burned in the air like the residue of incense, a scent that meant both worship and smoke. On the far edge of the ruin, a single lifter clawed its way free. A blade of hull metal shaving sparks off a mountain of cinders as it broke atmosphere. Those aboard strapped themselves into seats soaked through with the blood of those who had sat there first. Through a viewport crazed with fractures, someone watched the planet shrink, one wobbling eye focused on a world that seemed to fold its own light inward, as if it were ashamed of what it had been forced to reveal. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. A creed needs a place to stand. The creed had outlived the place. Cadia died on its feet. It died holding a door that could never be closed forever. It died so that the unending night might take a few more seconds to arrive. And in those seconds, the Imperium found the strength to stagger forward into an age without maps. The fortress fell. The gate yawned. The galaxy shuddered. The truth did not change. The darkness is patient, and walls are only delays measured in corpses. There are moments in history when the death of a world becomes the birth of a wound. Cadia was not the first planet to burn. It was not the last. But it was different, for Cadia had been more than soil, more than stone, more than a mark on a star chart. Cadia was a wall, and walls are promises. Promises that behind them lies safety. Promises that beyond them, there is still something to protect. When Cadia died, the promise died with it. And across the galaxy, humanity felt the silence left behind. The survivors of that apocalypse were not heroes. They were remnants, shattered regiments torn from the surface in broken landers, ships that limped into the void with holds filled with the wounded and the mad, commanders who carried maps of territories that no longer existed. They did not speak of triumph. They spoke only of endurance, of having lived through something that had unmade their very identity. For to be Cadian had been to guard a world, and the world was gone. Creed himself was last seen amidst the collapse, his commands still rolling across voxnets as the ground tore itself open beneath him. Some say he died with his caesar, a general entombed with his people. Others whisper that he was dragged into the warp by hands unseen, a trophy for the gods. In truth, his fate matters less than the shadow he left behind, for Creed was Cadia, and in his silence, the fortress finally fell quiet. Those who escaped carried the words with them. Cadia stands. But the phrase no longer meant what it once had. It was not a vow of defiance. It was not a rallying cry. It was an echo, a reminder of a world that no longer existed, a ghost of discipline and sacrifice that haunted every battlefield that came after. The regiments of Cadia fought on, scattered across the stars, their banners singed and their numbers dwindling. Every guardsman who bore the aquila of that broken world carried not only a weapon, but a gravestone. Their eyes were hollow, their salutes mechanical, their very existence a reminder that humanity's strongest wall had been reduced to dust. The galaxy reacted as only the galaxy can, with indifference clothed as mourning. High lords issued decrees of remembrance, their voices flat as they enumerated the number of regiments lost. Forge worlds calculated the tithe of replacements required to fill the gap. The ecclesiarchy preached sermons of martyrdom, declaring Cadia's fall a holy sacrifice ordained by the emperor. But beneath the sermons, beneath the decrees, beneath the rhetoric, there was fear. For if Cadia could die, what else could? If Cadia could fall, what fortress could ever be trusted? Abaddon did not need to gloat. The ruin itself was his testament. He had not simply destroyed a planet. He had cut a hole in the psyche of the Imperium, a hole that could never be patched. The Black Crusade had achieved its purpose. The gate to the eye was wider than ever, and the Imperium's faith in its own permanence was fractured. The War Master had not only won a battle, he had won a truth, that no defense endures forever. The pylons were gone. The warp storms grew. Navigation across vast tracts of the segmentum obscurus became a nightmare. Whole fleets lost in tides of madness. Whole worlds isolated to starve and turn feral. The age of Imperium staggered onward, but now each step was slower, each burden heavier. In the Schola Progenium, orphans learned of Cadia not as a place but as a lesson, that service means death, and even death buys nothing permanent. In hive cities light years away, workers whispered the words, "Cadia stands," with bitterness, a phrase stripped of its hope, leaving only the aftertaste of futility. On shrine worlds, statues were raised, towering monuments of plasteel depicting shock troopers, standing defiant against the storm. Pilgrims came to weep before them, lighting candles at their feet, chanting the creed that was now both anthem and eulogy. But the statues were hollow. No monument could hold back the truth. Cadia had stood for 10,000 years, and 10,000 years had not been enough. The survivors themselves drifted like ghosts through the endless war. Their regiments were folded into other campaigns, broken pieces hammered into new shapes. On Armageddon, they bled into the dust against the orcs. On Vigilus, they held trenches against traitor Astartes until only bones remained. On unnamed frontier worlds, they died in silence, their records misfiled, their graves unmarked. But wherever they stood, the same chant followed them, whispered by lips too cracked to smile. Cadia stands. It was not pride, it was spite. It was not defiance, it was resignation spoken loudly enough to echo into eternity. The Imperium staggered forward into an age of greater night. Cadia was gone, but its death had brought no end to war, no respite, no salvation. Instead, it had purchased only a deeper wound, a more profound despair, a proof written in stone and blood that humanity's defenses were illusions. The eye of terror gaped wider, vomiting forth nightmares without restraint. Planets once shielded by Cadia now felt the touch of the abyss, and their cries joined the endless chorus of the damned. What remains of Cadia is not soil or stone, but memory. Memory carved into the hearts of soldiers who will never return home. For home no longer exists. Memory burned into the reports of administratum clerks who tally losses without end. Memory whispered in the warp itself, where demons shriek laughter at the thought of a fortress that claimed to stand forever and lasted only until the gods remembered its name. In the final truth, Cadia's death is not a tragedy. It is a lesson that nothing is eternal. Not walls, not empires, not faith. The Imperium endures not because it is strong, but because it has not yet been devoured. Cadia was devoured, and so too, in time, will every world. The fortress world is gone, but its shadow stretches across the galaxy like an epitaph. Cadia does not stand, it never will again, and in the endless night of the 41st millennium, the only certainty is that every fortress is only another tomb waiting to be filled. Cadia fell. The Imperium bleeds. The galaxy burns. And still the chant echoes, hollow and eternal, a curse as much as a creed. Cadia stands.